You know, I think about the pandemic as a kind of 2-year global course in public health. And you know, it's been a long 2 years, and it's been a difficult course. And we're still in the midst of the final exam. And it's not clear that we're going to pass. And it's not clear yet what the lessons are. It really has been, as Pedro said, it's put public health on political agendas, and it's taught political leaders about public health. Let me go to your questions, Asim. First, you said, well, what's the biggest challenge that comes from the pandemic? For me, the biggest challenge is selecting the biggest challenge. You know, there's so many challenges that the pandemic has highlighted. Let me start with one that's close, that I think everyone feels in public health, and that is the lack of training for epidemiologists on how to speak to the public. Public communication about public health problems, and especially about talking about uncertainty. We've seen some people in the US context who've done a good job, but if we think back to the beginning of the pandemic, it seems like another world when we still had Trump as president. The public communication was a disaster. And I think there were similarly problems at WHO. So that's the first point. The second challenge, biggest challenge for me, is the maldistribution of global resources. We've seen this for vaccines. We've seen it for monoclonal antibody treatments. We've seen it for production of vaccines. We've seen it for patents. We've seen it for the wonderful drugs that have been produced so quickly. And it's the weaknesses of those institutions that were created to promote redistribution. I think there's going to be some critical thinking about COVAX, for example, and why there still are low levels of vaccination within Africa. The third biggest challenge for me, I think, is actually the nature of vaccines and the way that the pandemic has raised around the world in many different settings, negative reactions, resistance, skepticism, active denial about vaccines. You know, vaccines are a funny technology. It's something foreign that you take into your body to get your body to produce defenses for a threat that may happen in the future that you can't see. And I think that there are these social reactions to vaccines appear in different ways in different countries, but they have a long psychological and historical and social roots. I did an article, as you mentioned, Asim, with Professor Andrew Gordon, a historian at Harvard, on Japan, and we looked at 150 years of social responses to vaccines. And this kind of negative reaction goes back to the first introduction of vaccines, the Jennerian vaccine against smallpox in the mid-1800s. So I think understanding how to talk about vaccines to people in ways that they can understand and accept them. And again, it has to do with questions of risk. The fourth biggest challenge has already been mentioned, and I think that the biggest challenge for me is that somehow, as COVID has started to seem to decline, we've returned to war in Europe with tanks in streets, bombardment of civilians and cities, just you know, scenes that were appearing 70 years ago in World War II. It's just incredible, and in some ways, this is a failure of global institutions, and raising questions of even more dramatic failures in terms of chemical, biological, and nuclear warfare. So are there any signs of hope? I think one of the best signs of hope is something that Sylvia mentioned and that Pedro has participated in, and that is the opportunities for rethinking other public health problems. And I've engaged in an effort on rethinking malaria, organized by Professor Diane Worth at Harvard and done in collaboration with WHO in Geneva and with scholars, especially in Africa, researchers, and it's really to bring in new thinkers to reflect on the pandemic and say, what have we learned that can be used to solve these age-old problems around questions of governance, around questions of service delivery, around questions of human capacity and learning. The other example of a sign of hope is that I think that actually the pandemic has had an impact on political leaders and political thinking. Different ways in different countries, but it has said, infectious diseases matter and they have to be addressed. The new vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, have been incredible. And here's, technology can help. And the treatments that have been rapidly developed, I have friends who've taken them. So again, technology can provide solutions in some ways, in some timeframes. And one example of a change in thinking was Japan's decision to promote the HPV vaccine after having it unofficially recommended and almost went from 70% usage to 1% usage. At the end of last year, they agreed to start the active recommendation again, and they will reintroduce it. I think that's reflecting a rethinking about vaccines among political leaders. So your third question is, how do we take these lessons forward? I think that I think we need better institutions for doing active learning with practitioners about public health crises, and that really brings together public policy, public health, and political leadership. And I think that it has to be in settings that allow critical thinking, critical reflections, and ways to rethink old problems.